Okay, good evening from Japan time and good morning UK time, colleagues. Welcome to the number 21st Tourism Online Forum series in July 2023. This series is hosted by the Center for Advanced Tourism Research, CATS, at Hokkaido University, and this is your host, Mo. Today, we are very honored to have Professor Tim to share his recent research, some pieces related to tourist atmospheres. And Tim Edensor is a professor of social and cultural geography at the Institute of Place Management, Manchester Metropolitan University. He is the author of Tourists at the Taji back to 1998. National Identity, Pop Culture and Everyday Life, 2002. Industry Ruins, Space, Aesthetics and Materiality, 2005. And From Light to Dark, Daylight, Illumination, and Gloom from 2017. I heard this presentation in Wakayama, actually. And Stone Stories and Urban Materiality, 2020. He is also editor of Geography of Realism, 2010, co-editor of Routledge Handbook of Place, 2020, and Rethinking Darkness, Culture, Histories, and Processes, 2020. Sorry if I pronounced it wrong. Weather, Spaces, Mobility, and Effects, 2020. His most recent publication, The Landscape, Materiality, and Heritage, an Object Biography, 2022, and a book about Scottish medieval cross. And please note that this online lecture will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel of Center for Advanced Tourism Research. So let's invite Professor Tim to share his lecture. Thank you, Tim.
Fabulous, thanks, Mo. There we go. Right. Okay, so thanks for coming, everybody. It's great that there's quite a few of you here. I'm giving this presentation from Hampstead in London in my upstairs office. So what I want to do is to talk about tourist atmospheres. Now, this is part of a sort of longer standing project of mine, where I want to argue that tourist theories have suffered from a great overemphasis on meaning, on the meanings that circulate around how tourists interpret the places that they go to. And I think, in general, we might say that theories about tourism focus on how tourists temporarily move away from their surroundings to pursue meaningful experiences that will give them greater understanding about the world, themselves, other places, and people. But, and this is the crucial thing here, is that I think that tourism is as much about feeling as it is about meaning. Okay, so it's about feeling. It's also, therefore, tourism is concerned with moving away and seeking a change, only a temporary change, in emotional, affective, and sensory difference. And so what I want to talk about here is one way in which we might address this. How might we think about tourism as prompted, as motivated by desire for feelings? And so what I want to do then is to focus on the idea of atmosphere. Now, atmosphere has become a very popular idea in the European American sociology and geography and social sciences. Now, I just want you to think about atmosphere for a minute. And what is an atmosphere? It's quite difficult when I say to you, what is an atmosphere? But in a sense, most of us will recognize particular kinds of atmospheres when we are in the middle of them. So I mean, just think about this. When you go to a music concert, maybe you go out for a few drinks in a crowded bar, or maybe you go to a sporting event, a football game or a baseball game. We often say, well, the atmosphere was great. Or we might say, there wasn't much atmosphere. So also then, let's think about the atmosphere at a Zen temple. Let's think about what kind of atmospheres we might experience at a theme park, at a railway station, at a shopping centre. And so, although atmosphere seems to be a very kind of difficult thing to kind of explain, we all know them. We all know what an atmosphere is. We can talk about it. And it's kind of interesting is that when I did research on Blackpool, so I did some research on Blackpool Illuminations, which is a huge light festival that's taken place for about 130 years, in what is usually thought of as the world's first working class holiday resort in Blackpool in the north of England. It's a very big holiday resort. And we interviewed people about how they felt about the illuminations. They were walking through Blackpool, along by the sea at night, looking at all these lights, all these beautiful lights. And we interviewed 100 people, and about 75 of them said, or 75% said, well, we like the atmosphere. But then when we asked them what they meant by that, it was difficult for them to actually conceptualize what atmosphere is. So what I want to do first then is to think about how might we understand atmosphere. And so first of all, I'll say something about that, about how we might conceive of atmosphere. And I want to say something about why I want to say a little bit more about why I think very influential theories about tourism have been quite harmful, have stopped other kinds of thinking about tourism. I'll say that first. And then I want to talk about tourist atmospheres. And I want to think about how tourist atmospheres might be designed. They're designed by the tourist industry, by architects. And we know these atmospheres, and we can, when I sort of explain them, when I describe them, I think you will probably understand, you'll recognize the qualities that I'm talking about. And so I'll talk about a variety of different ways in which tourist sites are designed. Now, the second thing that I want to talk about is there's quite a lot of, there's a few problems with some of the literature on atmosphere, is because they often suggest that we enter an atmosphere and we can't do anything about it. We're in the middle of an atmosphere. We're passive creatures. We're passive. We just have to just accept the atmosphere and go along with it. But I want to emphasize, in fact, that tourists are co-producers of atmosphere. We, as tourists, we produce them as well. And I want to say something about how tourist atmospheres are quite unpredictable as well. So although I want to say something about how tourist professionals try to design atmospheres, I also want to say that this isn't an exact science. We can never really know whether these techniques will work. Okay, so to start with then, I want to really start with kind of what I regard as the three most influential understandings that have accounted for tourism. And these still continue to have a great influence. And so this limited number of concepts are still deployed to claim that different desires and motivations inspire a desire for meaning, a search for meaning. And so this profound overemphasis on meaning and tourism, I think, has overlooked their emotional and sensory experiences and the desires for sensory and emotional intensity, strong experience of emotions and sensations. Okay, so the three theories that I just want to talk about, and you'll all recognize these, I think, at least two of them. And the most dominant theory, and it's still such a powerful explanatory framework, is Dean McCannell's idea that tourists are searching for authenticity. They're searching for things. They live in these worlds that have now become kind of quite inauthentic, and they want to experience authenticity in other places that they often believe have not been so damaged by modern processes, but where you can still find authenticity. And there's a lot of different ways in which authenticity has been explained over the years since McCannell wrote his book. But the most important thing to say here is that to start with, is that authenticity, the idea about authenticity, is about a search for meaning. So it's about meaning, right? So again, this one idea about authenticity is about searching for meaning. The second thing, of course, and everybody will know this, I think, about Victor Turner and his anthropological notion of liminality and the way in which that's been taken up by tourist academics and in understanding tourism is a search for liminality, not a search for authenticity, but a search for liminality. So a liminality is entering a state in which the usual conventions of behavior, of sensation, of meaning don't apply. They don't apply. So meaning is kind of changed. It's inverted. People can escape from the usual meanings that they exist within. And so liminality then is a state also is understood to be a thing that tourists look for to find meaning, to find greater meaning. And then the final thing, which I think is quite interesting, which is probably less influential, but still is kind of very important, I think, is Jonathan Culler's idea that tourists are what he calls an unsung army of semioticians. And really, a semiotician is somebody who tries to find meaning in things. They try to read signs as they move through the world. So they, British tourists to Japan might be trying to read signs of what it is that characterizes Japanese culture, for instance. They search for the signifiers of cultural, environmental, or material difference. And so again, they're looking for these kind of sites of meaning. They try to piece together their experiences. They try to make sense of them. They try to understand the meanings that they're consuming. So all these three ideas, just to emphasize, are about searching for meaning. So it's tourism as a search for meaning. I could have used other theories as well, where the emphasis is on tourist motivations and the search for meaning. Now, I don't want to say that these ideas are entirely useless. I'm not saying that at all. They certainly do have certain, they have a certain kind of truth to them, I think. But the truth isn't something that we can generalize about tourism. This is the key thing, because I think that these theories are extremely overgeneral, are often functionalist, very functional in terms of thinking about how tourists do things within this larger thing called society. And I think they're also incredibly ethnocentric. So really, we are talking about white middle-class men from European and American settings moving into other kinds of places. And so I think it's a real problem in tourist studies that these ideas, these kinds of ideas, and others like them, have emphasized the search for meaning and representation. So while they all might capture some experiences amongst some tourists, some of the time, they are not overarching theories that carry any kind of weight. Because I don't think that's what tourism is. I think tourism is made up of absolutely multiple motivations, experiences that combine meaning and emotion and sensation, which is what I want to talk about today, about feeling. Okay. So in order to do that, as I've said, I want to say something about atmospheres and tourism. So again, let's think about atmosphere. And as I talk about atmosphere, what I'd like you to do as listeners is just to think about the atmospheres that you know and that you're very familiar with. I have no doubt that you all do have experience of particular kinds of atmospheres. They're sort of atmospheres that surround us all the time, really. So atmospheres then the atmospheres that we move into, or that we live in, or that we're familiar with, are things into which we are immersed. Now, what's really important when we think about atmosphere, as the German philosopher Gernot Böhmer says, is that they're intermediate. In other words, they don't belong in the world out there or in the individual person, but they circulate between them. So they circulate between the objective and subjective, right? So they're not kind of things we can kind of scientifically apply or understand or kind of examine. From a distance perspective, we are already in the midst of them. And as I'll say, we contribute to them. Now, if you think about this for a little bit, about atmospheres and the places where atmospheres collect, there's no doubt that certain places are full of thicker atmospheres than others. So some atmospheres vary in intensity. So just for instance, in a tourist context, think about the powerful moods and infectious atmospheres at a busy holiday resort or a music festival, and then compare that, for instance, with a different kind of atmosphere that we might experience when we go for a solitary walk in the countryside, or we go on a spiritual retreat, a tourist spiritual retreat. And then think about just, in your own city or your own town, just think about how the atmosphere creates a particular kind of excitement as you move through the rush hour with lots of pedestrians rushing about. And then think about how that changes, when you're in the countryside, and what you do is the movement isn't made up of people moving around in traffic and noise, but actually from trees swaying in the breeze and birdsong. So these are very different kinds of atmospheres. And so this also foregrounds how atmospheres are endlessly composed and recomposed by a whole range of different elements, by changing qualities, rhythms, forces, relations, and movements. So they're not static. Atmospheres don't just stay and linger, they change and shift all the time, perhaps also in quite subtle ways. But we also, and what I want to draw attention to as well, is to think about how atmospheres change according to the qualities of air, the kinds of light, the colours, the movements, the seasons, the weather, the temperature, the sound and smell, and the way in which humans and non-humans move through the world. Now, atmospheres then are things made up of all these different elements. We enter an atmosphere, and more than this, Jean-Paul Thibault, a French scholar about atmosphere, refers to how atmosphere gives rhythm to our movements and modulates the manner in which we move. So in other words, it kind of sets a kind of environment or the conditions within which we act. The final thing that I want to say about this, about atmospheres, is that certain accounts, I've already mentioned this before, certain accounts contend that we enter atmospheres into which we are thrust and in which we kind of can't do anything about, and we just experience them. But I think it's important to understand how our previous sensory experiences, and especially our cultural habits or expectations, might influence how we respond to particular atmospheres. Because emotions and sensations have a culture, a history, a seasonality, an economy, and so on. So all our emotions and the different ways in which we sense the world are always culturally situated as well. Absolutely crucial to recognise that, I think. And what this means is that in tourist atmospheres, some of us may be familiar and we might be very comfortable with particular atmospheres, and we might contribute to the production of these atmospheres, but in other situations, or other people might not be comfortable. They might not enjoy the atmosphere. They might feel awkward, or the atmosphere might be unfamiliar to them, and they might withdraw from these atmospheres. I'll explain that a little bit more later on. Okay, so let's think more then about tourist atmospheres. And I want to think about atmospheres by thinking about how they're designed. And here I am talking about atmospheres in this theoretical way, but tourist professionals and workers and designers know very well about designing atmospheres, because enormous efforts go into the production of atmospheres by designers, architects, hotel staff, guides and other workers, where they hope to generate particular atmospheres and fulfill the desires of the tourists who are there. Now, certain kinds of tourist space are highly designed and intensely managed to produce distinctive atmospheres that are conducive to particular desires. Now, again, going back to Jean-Paul Thibault, he suggests that explicit strategies aim to transform the sounds, smells, lights, colours, temperature and air quality that shape the conditions under which we understand place and experience space. And of course, these strategies, and you might think about this more widely, are especially increasing in spaces that host activities that are related to consumption. Now, one example in which we might think about this is the contemporary shopping mall. And I know you have lots of shopping malls in Japan, and they're kind of quite different, they diverge, but we might think about how they're designed to produce particular kinds of atmospheres. So the contemporary shopping mall acts as a way in which we might grasp this manipulation of atmosphere and feeling with carefully chosen background music, particular kinds of lighting, to offer a kind of an ambience, a kind of atmosphere that also includes the showcasing of products. Now, Healy argues that this careful control of temperature, sound and movement is part of a wider, what he calls biopolitical control over our bodies, wherein the disoriented, somewhat a kind of disorientated but kind of calmed sense is created. And so as shoppers, and also as tourists sometimes, Healy says that what he says is we're lulled into a state of distraction, and we follow specific pathways, and therefore, because we're kind of lulled into this kind of sense of relaxation, but kind of also not really focusing on anything. He also says that this kind of facilitates strategies that make us buy things. Now, what I want to say here is about these about these shopping centres, is that there are very strong parallels with the atmospheric designs of what I've long called tourist enclaves. That is, those resorts that are shut off from the rest of the world, luxury resorts into which we enter. And in these luxury resorts that are increasingly popular across the world, usually in kind of beach-like settings, particular kinds of atmospheres are created. And these luxury hotels and resorts really work very hard to create a particular kind of relaxing atmosphere. And so we might think, as soon as we arrive at one of these places, in a way, the atmosphere is already established by the fact that we're served a cocktail as soon as we arrive there. Now, sound is often very carefully kind of moderated. So they will have music that plays, but it won't be disruptive music. It won't be heavy rock or free jazz. It'll be kind of gentle ambient music that makes us feel at home, supposedly. And at night, this might change because there might be more lively musical performances in which local musicians play local music. But usually what they do is they play international popular hit songs. But again, they're not going to do anything in which harsh and loud notes disruptors. Other key workers offer friendly and enthusiastic interactions, working at generating a relaxed and convivial atmosphere. And in addition, think about the textures of these places, think about the materialities of them, because often they're very smooth, and there's the furniture is very soft and comfortable. The sheets are kind of very soft as well, and perfect. And air conditioning encloses our bodies if it's too hot and makes sure that we're comfortable. And these spaces, these tourist spaces, which are so extremely managed, they show how we can enter these worlds, these luxury worlds, and we know what they're going to be like. They're reliable, they're luxurious, and predictable. And so we can self-consciously relax in this very carefully managed atmosphere. And what's kind of interesting about this is, and again, you might think about if you yourself have stayed in one of these luxury holiday resorts, you might think about how these kind of atmospheres also, if you like, they kind of persuade us to act in particular ways. So we don't kind of we ourselves don't start to shout or run or dash about. But we also, behave in particular ways that contribute to this atmosphere. Now, other sites of tourist consumption are perhaps not quite as closely managed, but nevertheless, a lot of work is undertaken to provide an atmosphere that is conducive to consuming, dining, relaxing, and gazing at things. Also, one of these things we might identify these sorts of things, which are occurring in lots of different tourist, especially around heritage, that are around audio-visual displays. And so what they do is they create particular kind of emotional ambiances or atmospheres that are kind of lively, but that are kind of aren't necessarily about just giving us information, but also about giving us kinds of feelings. So, dramatic light and sound shows, sometimes characters, animatronic characters, films, sounds, animated films that conjure up the imagined feel of the past rather than the meaning of the past. So the feel of the past becomes quite important. In a way, you usually, like in the old days, you'd have an expert there, an expert guide who would tell you what the past meant and what happened. Now it's much more about transmitting the feeling of the past, or a sense of what the past felt like as well, through this kind of creation of an atmosphere. And you also get this at heritage sites where actors are employed to engage with the visitors. And so, for instance, here, this is just one example, which is called Quarrybank Mill. It's an 18th century cotton mill in the north of England. And here you can see the old machinery, the old looms. And what happens as you kind of enter here and you stand here, costumed actors approach visitors and engage them in particular kinds of dramas. So, for instance, one actor plays the recruitment officer of the mill. He wants to, employ you and your children, and he's dressed in old-fashioned clothing, and he demands that parents encourage their children to work in the factory. So there'll be parents and children on a kind of day visit as tourists, and they kind of demonstrate, or they involve you in a kind of an emotional exchange that actually, in some ways, highlights how the relations of the factory were exploitative and oppressive. Now, most people go along with this. Most people are happy to engage in this kind of playful interaction. Of course, it's kind of interesting. I've been to this place, and some people are frightened. It makes people scared. They don't want to engage with the actors at all. No, that's not what we've come here for. There's too much feeling, there's too much emotion there. Now, another thing that I want to mention here is that tourists themselves also want to enter into atmospheric settings that produce particular kinds of experiences of emotion and sensation that are very different to what they experience every day. And I think a really good way of thinking about this is to think through adventure sports like bungee jumping, trekking, mountain biking, and canoeing. And these are all kind of very exciting and atmospherically charged practices. Anybody who's done any of these things will know this. And I think this photograph captures this really well. We can all imagine what this atmosphere feels like, even if we've never done this, and I've never done it, but we can imagine what it's like to go on this whitewater rafting. We can imagine the giddy, excitable kind of atmosphere as the boat surges through the river and everybody's shouting and laughing and cheering and being excited. And we might also think about how this also happens in amusement parks, usually on the faster, higher white knuckle rides that create this kind of, this excitement, this giddy excitement. You can kind of think about how, when people go on a roller coaster, they get to the top and then everybody puts their hands up like that and it shoots down. And so everybody's there kind of participating in the production of this exciting atmosphere, with screaming as well. And what I want to say here is that these atmospheres are also designed. So it's easy to see how the luxury tourist resort is atmospherically designed. But we also might want to think about how these sites are atmospherically designed as well, these experiences. Another thing that I want to say is that we might also think about, and this is quite a prominent theme, and this is also, actually, there's a paper in Annals of Tourism Research that has just come out that talks about this. And this is about how cities now try to create what they call a buzz. So the buzz is connected to the kind of atmosphere of cultural excitement. All sorts of shops and theatres and cafes that they attract tourists to, heritage sites, shopping opportunities, sporting offers, walks and guided tours, cities that have this kind of buzz that they use a lot. So that word buzz, let's B-U-Z-Z, we might understand that as atmosphere. So tourists, so city marketers, people promoting cities and tourism in cities, want to create this idea of a buzz that tourists can enter, can come into and experience the atmosphere of a particularly exciting, culturally oriented city. Now, there's no doubt that this has really expanded quite a lot in recent years, the idea that cities can draw in tourists in this way. But it's far from new, as are and this is the same also for, the white knuckle rides or the theme parks. And here we might go back to think about in Coney Island in New York, this huge resort that opened at the turn of the 20th century. And we can imagine walking in this kind of place and we can imagine how it feels. And so Gary Cross, who's written about Coney Island and these two particular fairgrounds there, Luna Park and Dreamland, he says that they created a dazzling architectural fantasy of towers, domes and minarets, outlined by electric lights, giving these strange oriental shapes an even more mysterious and magical air at night. And we can imagine this kind of atmosphere, right? And in recent years, and I've written quite a lot about this, new technologies and different kind of artistic forms of creativity with regard to illumination has inspired hundreds and thousands of light festivals to emerge across the world. And again, these are kind of very important tourist events for places. And these can be very, very large festivals, and they can be kind of quite small and intimate as well. But they focus, well, what they do is they get large and they get crowds together around particular light installations or light art to generate this kind of atmospheric intensity. And we might also think then more broadly about how tourism is increasingly interested, the tourism industry is increasingly interested in creating all sorts of other festivals as well, around drama, around music, street art, to kind of produce these kind of atmospheres into which tourists can enter. And also, another atmosphere that I want to mention here, and I don't know if any of you have been to Goa in India, but in Goa, hundreds of thousands of tourists, young tourists, go there to go to these full moon parties on the beach where they play particular kinds of electronic music. And Aaron Saldana's written about this, and he focuses on the rich stimulations that contribute to a really, really intense experience. And so while you're in the midst of this crowd, there are the sounds of the music being played, the beat of the music, combined with the smells of sweat, kerosene, and cannabis, the sight of the moon, swaying coconut trees, the expressive movements of dancing bodies, the heat, the humidity, and these are often mixed with the effects of sensory enhancing drugs to produce this incredibly thick atmosphere. And I think you can probably imagine, even if you haven't been to such an event or events like this, you can imagine it. It's kind of easy to imagine what this might feel like, this very heightened atmosphere. Now, I want to switch sort of tack a little bit here to think about different kinds of tourism. Those tourists that seek atmospheres where they can relax, they can escape the rhythms of the working day, but also enter worlds that are kind of quiet and peaceful. So a peaceful atmosphere. And we can think about this simply by all those different kinds of tourism endeavors where people go into the countryside and maybe they walk, or they watch birds, or they just hang out. They don't really do very much, they just relax. And these, of course, are sites where there aren't many people. And so here, the role of the non-human in generating atmosphere becomes really important. And so think about, when you go to a kind of rural setting, about how there's a completely different atmosphere to those that I've talked about so far, about the role of water, weather, plants, animals, daylight and sunlight, and how we're in the midst of this kind of peaceful setting, this peaceful rural setting, in which we're kind of part of this kind of quiet atmosphere. And we know that these nature-based tourist ventures are also part of what we might call the rise of slow tourism. So slow tourism has been a kind of quite an important addition to forms of tourism. And the emphasis here is immersing yourself in the unhurried rhythms of the day or a journey. And during such processes, we kind of savor the sound, the movement, and the colour in a very particular way. So, for instance, here's a boat trip, I think in Vietnam, but a slow boat trip that might last several days. And we might think about this again, how we might go and stay in a sort of village or rural setting where the rhythms in eating and working contrast with the busier tempo of city life. So we like to go to these places and absorb the atmospheric sensory qualities in a kind of leisurely way. And here, I suppose this is the kind of, the ultimate of this kind of tourist relaxation. Again, in in Asia, especially in India and also in Japan, the idea that tourists like to go to ashrams and meditation centers where prolonged meditation can take place. And Zhang et al. From 2018 describe how tourists visiting Chinese temples to undertake Zen meditation camps enter an atmosphere that separates their temporary condition from the secular world, both in distance and in perceptions, making them more reflective of self and the human condition in a context of meditation. So meditation requires these kinds of very quiet, relaxed, slow, gentle atmospheres in order for it to work properly. And of course, these things as well are kind of expanding in popularity. Okay, so I've given you quite a diverse range of ways in which atmospheres are produced by tourist professionals to meet the desires of tourists. But what I also want to emphasize is how tourists themselves co-produce atmospheres. Not to pick up what I was saying before. They're not simply passive. People are not simply passive when they're tourists, but no, they kind of participate in producing the atmosphere. Now, I've explored this in two ways. And first of all, I've explored this. This is my football club, Manchester City Football Club, where I kind of go most weeks when the football season's on. And what you know, if you go to a football game, is that you actually contribute to the stadium, and in contributing to you contribute to the atmosphere, and in contributing to the atmosphere of the stadium during the match day, you're a kind of participant in producing that atmosphere. And you can kind of think about, your own experiences of this maybe, but fans sing, and they clap and they chant, and most people do this, and that transmits itself to the players on the pitch. And it makes the whole experience kind of much more intense emotionally. So we produce this atmosphere. I've also looked at this. This is Blackpool, again, to go back to Blackpool Illuminations, this very old illumination festival. And here again, so when you're walking, it says this Blackpool Illuminations takes place in the autumn. So it starts to get dark, it's not so warm anymore. And light, wind, sea, illumination and sound are really important in producing this kind of atmosphere, but so is the excitable ways in which people move through this space. They add to it, and they arrive at this working class holiday resort already expecting to experience certain things and already prepared to carry out particular kinds of activities. So they're not like the tourists at the typical tourist at the luxury resort who tend to be kind of quite quiet and relaxed. They're quite vocal, they make quite a lot of noise, they walk a lot, they're in large groups, they stop and have drinks and eat, and they're kind of part of this atmosphere. So I wanted to say that. So, and we can think about this, this is a very British thing, but nonetheless, when you go to an airport, it can even be quite early in the morning in Britain, and it's the summer and people are heading off on holiday, maybe to Spain or to Italy or to the south of France. People go to the bars and they drink. And they create this kind of atmosphere. They often get cheap flights, and they create this kind of atmosphere in the airport itself, even before they've arrived at their holiday destination. So they're already primed, they're already kind of involved in producing a particular atmosphere that starts at the airport and then continues at the resort. And we might also think of, no, not yet. We might think about bank holiday crowds. So, I'm sure there are Japanese equivalents on holidays, on particular collective holidays when people head to the beach and to other coastal locations, and think about how excitedly they get on the train and they get off at the coastal location at the resort and they head to the beach or the promenade or the amusement arcade, and they're already kind of excitable and excited. And here, this is an example I wanted to show you here. These are quite notorious, these holidays. That are really about involving young people in co-producing an atmosphere. And here, this is an example of a club, 18 to 30 holidays. I don't know if you're familiar with these, but these are occasions when large groups of young people go on organised holidays, usually in warm, hot places like this, and they themselves are caught up in producing an atmosphere. And so the tourist companies get them all excited about having a holiday that's full of excess, drinking games, sporting competitions, and all sorts of other kind of crazy carnivalesque activities. And you can kind of, and the young people, the young participants, are typically then willing to suspend their usually more kind of reserved social habits, and they become much more expressive and extrovert. And this captures this really well, this foam party here that takes place. That is staged, but as you can see, the young people are kind of fully engaged in it. They're not standing back and looking at it. They're kind of immersed and co-producing the atmosphere. But again, I want to kind of say, and I think this is kind of quite important, is that it's important to acknowledge that in thinking about this co-production of atmospheres, that not all tourists respond favourably to the atmospheres that designers have created. Again, I want to emphasise, it is not an exact science. So it might be the atmosphere that designers want to and managers want to create might be disrupted. And here we can see how tourists who don't want to go along with these atmospheres and don't conform to the kinds of behaviours that are expected might disrupt the atmosphere. So here's this kind of naughty boy standing on these statues and disrupting the atmosphere. And we might think about other things. And again, you can think about this, about your own tourist experiences. So for instance, if you're at a resort and children are running wild, or a family is arguing, or guests get too drunk, maybe there's a sudden blackout or storm, this can shatter the carefully created atmosphere, and it can break that mood. At an amusement park, a ride might break down, generating complaint and dissatisfaction. And on the other hand, we should also say that certain things can happen that enhance the atmosphere. So a funny incident, or meeting someone you hadn't expected to see, or a sudden shift in the weather can also alter the mood, but this time in a positive way, in a way that it doesn't disrupt the atmosphere but enhances it. And again, I want to emphasise that some people can anticipate certain kinds of atmospheres and are enthusiastically involved in co-producing those atmospheres, but others might be repelled by this. So these different desires for different kinds of atmospheres can generate all sorts of competitions. And here I wanted to give you an example of a conflict that took place in the north of England, in what we call the Lake District, this national park full of lakes. And the most popular lake, or the lake that most people go to, is called Windermere. And until about 10, 15 years ago, Windermere was full of these power boats that used to charge up and down the lake, making a huge amount of noise, and as you can see, spray. And it completely transformed what was a peaceful atmosphere into this kind of, excitable, noisy atmosphere. But then a larger number of tourists started to complain about this and said, look, we don't want this. We don't want this kind of atmosphere. We want a tranquil, quiet atmosphere and we want to walk along the shores of the lake, and we don't want to hear this incredible noise. And so what happened in the end was that these boats were banned from carrying out their sport in their high-powered boats. And so now if you go to Windermere, the atmosphere is much quieter. We might also think about this, and again, I don't know how you'll respond to this, but at the fairground and amusement park, many people are very excited by the mix of loud music, shouts, and mechanical noises, and the way in which when we go on one of these fairground rides, we're kind of really disorientated by the ways in which we're moved around and at high speed. And that can be irresistible. That atmosphere can be irresistible for many of us. But for others, they're frightened of it. And they don't like it and they wouldn't go. And they would find the atmosphere overpowering. And we might also then think though, that these people who like the fair may not enjoy the peaceful atmosphere that you would experience by a slow boat journey along the Mekong River. They might think the atmosphere is dull, tedious, and unexciting. Now, in a tourist context, under conditions of global mediatization, where everything's reported all the time, and widespread news reports, the atmospheres of tourism are also affected by an awareness about political events. And perhaps most obvious, the emergence of terrorist attacks at popular attractions and ideas about instability and violence might induce atmospheres characterized by caution and fear. So what would have been excitable is now transformed into a journey that might be accompanied by concern and fear. And so those atmospheres are also particularly kind of, might produce, might be negative, might not be what the tourists want to experience. So when you arrive at an airport in which armed security personnel, rigorous luggage inspection and interviewing of passengers is not conducive to entering the state of relaxation and informality that most tourists desire. It's a scary atmosphere. And similarly here, I've tried to give an example of the practices undertaken by anti-tourist activities who are furious about the economic and social transformation of their neighbourhoods, particularly in places like Barcelona and Berlin, where there's huge amounts of what we might call over-tourism. And in fact, I was in the capital, in Lisbon last week, in Portugal, and in the centre of Lisbon, in the Barrio Alto, it was just full of tourists. There were virtually no locals there at all. And so there's this seething movements of tourists through these old streets, and it's kind of transformed it. And again, Lisbon inhabitants are very unhappy about this. It's where tourism itself has completely transformed the atmosphere of place. So just to emphasize then, these atmospheres disclose how tourists often arrive in holiday settings already emotionally primed for the experiences that they're going to have. And this, of course, is also further generated by the promotional and advertising material that they've already consumed in anticipation of their holidays. And so imaginary geographies and daydreams are stimulated by the marketing of tourist places in brochures, internet sites, and travel reviews. And so these kind of meanings produce particular kinds of atmospheres as well. So there's an interesting way in which you might think about how meanings and feelings kind of come together, actually a lot of the time. And again, just to emphasize that this marketing is also increasingly accompanied by tourists themselves, who do a lot of emotional work in creating these kinds of anticipations by contributing to blogs and reviews of tourist destinations, or maybe making their own blogs. And so they themselves are increasingly kind of engaged in producing these feelings. Okay, so to conclude, what I've tried to do is I've tried to critique much theory, tourist theory, for its overgeneral, ethnocentric and functionalist assertions. I've tried to show that tourism is about the search for feeling as much as meaning. And my particular angle here has been to focus on the production and consumption of atmospheres. And as I've tried to suggest, as tourism expands to absorb an ever greater range of sites and occasions, the diversity of these kind of atmospheres is also very diverse. And so my account has tried to provide lots of examples that these atmospheres might range from the very quiet and tranquil to that which is kind of very innovating and exciting. And I've emphasised that professional designers like engineers, architects, and many others seek to design atmospheres, tourist atmospheres, but that they can't be determined in advance. There's all sorts of unforeseen events, poor design, tourists that refuse to conform to a desired atmosphere, and those that prefer different kinds of atmospheres, mean that this is not an exact science. And I've also discussed how larger atmospheric conditions can be produced by local and global political events over which tourist managers have no control at all. And that certain tourists possess different preferences for atmospheres, for different kinds of atmospheres. And so this can kind of lead to contestation. Now, I have also disputed those theories that understand atmosphere as a phenomenon into which we're absorbed, whether we like it or not, because tourists come primed with their own expectations about the holiday atmosphere that they enter. And this is kind of important. This anticipation is important in generating the typically thick atmospheres of particular kinds of tourist places. Thank you. I will stop there.
Thank you very much. It's very informational and basically covers all the tourism phenomena, but through your theoretical lenses. So let's welcome in all kind of questions and comments. You can either leave your message from the Q&A box. Also, you can raise up your hand. Is there anybody in the audience want to ask questions? We have, okay, sure. I will allow you to talk. So you are good to go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Can't
Hi.
see you, but I can hear you.
I don't think the video can be turned on, but anyways, thank you for your wonderful presentation and fascinating aspect on tourism studies. So I am Mia Dillon. I'm a PhD student at Hokkaido University. And I am actually very fascinated about especially materiality and atmospheres. So in my PhD project, I would like to include atmospheres in some way. And I was wondering, what do you think are best ways of studying or investigating these atmospheres? Is it, for example, through interviews, as you mentioned, or actually participating, or how can I, well, turn the atmospheres that I, for example, feel into an academic text? So that's
a great question. That is a fantastic question, because of course it's very difficult to do this. And so, but what I would say is that it's quite interesting to think about certain kinds of interviews, but as I've suggested, when we tried this in Blackpool, people were very easily able to emphasise that there was a great atmosphere there. But when we tried to get them to unpick that, to understand what that meant, they struggled. Okay, so it's quite a difficult concept to kind of get. And so I suppose what I would say is that the best way of capturing atmosphere is there are two things you can do. First of all, you can try to explore what the design is, the design of a particular place, because nearly all tourist places, you know, they're not accidental. There's a lot of thought goes into their kind of management, the ways in which they're designed, the ways in which they allow certain kinds of movement, the way in which, you know, particular kinds of bars and restaurants are situated. These things aren't accidental, I think, in many ways. And so you could also then, in that sense, you could try to talk to tourist managers to find out, because I think they're aware of atmospheres. They might not articulate it in that way, but I think they're very aware of the kinds of feelings that they want to produce in these places, which have got to be positive, right? They have to be.
Yeah.
But the second thing, and I think perhaps the most important thing, but also this is a little bit you know, a lot of academic or certain academics don't really accept this, is I think autoethnography is kind of really important here. So in other words, you put your own body into the flow of atmosphere, into the feelings that you experience. And you can only do that, you've got to be kind of immersive about it. You know, it's a matter of kind of being there and situating yourself there, watching what people do. And you also might think about how that changes throughout the day. So, you know, you can be there and there might be a quiet atmosphere in the morning, but then it surges, it becomes more intense at lunchtime, and then it kind of in the afternoon, you know, maybe people have eaten, and so it becomes kind of quieter. And so there are ways in which I think you can put your own body into it. And I kind of think, in a way, you know, we've all been tourists. So why not really? Why not try to engage in those kind of thick descriptions of what's going on and what a place feels like? I would say that. Other people would resist that, but I kind of think as long as it's a supplement, as long as it's a methodological supplement to other kinds of methods, I think kind of auto-ethnographic and immersive practices are kind of quite, well, are very useful, especially when we're trying to get at things that are kind of difficult for people to talk about.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yes, that's kind of approaching it from kind of the professional side as well as the experiential side. Sounds like a very interesting and good way to approach atmosphere. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for the great question.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you. And while we also have quite a Q&A atmosphere here, we have 5 questions from text. I will try to repeat it one by one. And one is by Susanna Klein, and one of our professors here. Thanks, team, for a fascinating lecture. I'm wondering how we can best explore the elusive atmosphere as researchers. That's her question.
That's the question I've just really answered.
Okay, yeah.
Right? Same, right. Isn't it the same sort of thing? It is elusive. Atmosphere is elusive, and it changes all the time. And so because it changes all the time, we can never say anything definitive about it. But we can say, for instance, let's go back to the football as an example, is when Manchester City play Manchester United, it's the kind of local rivalry. I can almost be 100% certain that the atmosphere will be very thick and crazy. I can be sure of that. But on other games, I don't know. I mean, it could be, it might shift, it might change. It depends on what happens on the pitch. It depends on the time of year. It just might depend on the general mood. And it's very difficult to understand why the atmosphere is flat or alternatively excitable. And so we can only do that, as I answered to the previous question. I think we have to put our own bodies in it. We have to be a bit poetic. I think we have to be kind of, you know, and I think in a way, and I suppose another way we might do this is, I mean, one of the things that I really welcome across the social sciences and of geography especially, is the way in which art and creative practices, art, poetry, creative writing, photography, can kind of capture some of the things that are very difficult to talk about. And so I also think that there's a way in which we can either engage with artists themselves in the ways that they kind of capture meaning. Actually, when you talk about art, when you talk to artists, I've done this quite a lot because I was doing work on illumination. When you talk to artists, they're not very eloquent about what it is that they're trying to do. That's not because that's not what they do. They're interested in creating particular kinds of work to which you respond. And so artworks can really help, I think. But also, there isn't any reason why we ourselves can't undertake particular kinds of creative practices, maybe modestly, you know, like sort of thick description or particular kinds of photography that might help us to explore how atmospheres might be characterized in particular ways. So, yeah, I think that kind of creativity, that kind of adoption of a creative practice can also help as well, as can, where it's relevant, contacting artists or simply interpreting their work in ways that can be kind of quite productive, because they won't interpret it. They just say the work speaks for itself. But of course, as academics, we can be free to interpret it however we wish.
All right, thank you. So for the next question, maybe better, Yichin, you just answer alive. Is that okay? I will allow you to talk.
Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And thank you for your fantastic presentation. And my name is Yichin, and you can call me Stein. And I'm
Hi,
also
Stein.
yes, thank you. And I'm also now pro the atmosphere in well-being tourism through a Hermann Schmidt's. Do you know the German
right.
philosopher? His new phenomenology and the humanetic phenomenology. I would like to ask you some question below and like this. And how is atmosphere generally applied academically in tourism? And can something else be discovered through atmosphere? And are there some examples? And next will be the what advantage does it have over traditional research based on the subject-object dualism? What is its academic significance? And that's all. Thank you.
Okay, well, so it's kind of interesting what you say about Schmitz. I mean, I'm not that familiar with his work, but so you're probably best to read the work of Michael Bille. Have you come across him? Bille. He writes really interestingly about atmosphere, and he draws on that kind of German tradition more than I do, as do other academics as well. And so I guess my approach is more, I mean, I like Gernot Böhmer's work, and I like some of the kind of French interpretations. But I guess the inspiration for the rise in thinking about atmosphere is the what we might call across the social sciences in the UK anyway, and America and Europe, the affective turn. So the turn to thinking about affect, which is a difficult thing to think about, and it's interpreted in different ways by different folk. But I think the sort of emergence of atmosphere and why it's proved so popular, I think, in recent times, has been its kind of, its association with the affective turn. And I think that there has been, the affective turn then has kind of brought out much wider critiques of this, what we might call the sociological subject. And I think the sociological subject, there's a whole host of sociologists. Let me just say, I'll just give you one example, like a very famous sociologist, Irving Goffman, where he just thinks that people carry out what he calls particular performances in a very instrumental and strategic way. So everything that we do is about trying to establish our role in society or a particular social role, and also about imposing our meaning on situations. And I just don't think that's how we are most of the time. I think most of the time we're oblivious to these kinds of things. I don't think we know. I don't think we think about it. I just think we kind of get on with our lives. And so what I think is kind of really important about atmospheres and the affective turn is that they also foreground how much of life is habitual. Now, to take this a little bit further, I suppose a lot of the work that I've done has been on place. And the idea in tourism, if we think about how place is marketed in tourism, it's nearly always about meaning. So where I'm from, Manchester, in the north of England, Manchester is the heart of the Industrial Revolution. You can see, the roots of the Industrial Revolution. It's where Friedrich Engels, lived, and where Marx and Engels studied. It's where a kind of working class emerged, where the cotton industry developed the first kind of mass industrial production. It's also, in recent times, it's a site of football and music. And so it's also a kind of cultural hub that attracts lots of kind of young people and sports fans. Okay, so that's how Manchester will be understood. But I prefer to think about Manchester through the way in which maybe it's less obvious elements. So, for instance, in terms of its colours, in terms of the way the light sort of tries to break through the gloomy clouds, in terms of the number of parks that there are that provide these kind of green contrasts to the industrial city. in accordance with the kind of places where large numbers of people congregate and kind of move around, or also kind of quiet suburban streets. So all those elements of kind of light, colour, sound, I think they're kind of absolutely integral to our experience of place, but we usually don't think about them because they surround us. And so we experience them unreflexively. And so really, the only time we become aware of these feelings, of these sensations, of what makes our place particular in terms of its light, its colours and so forth, is when we go away to other places. And suddenly, those everyday conditions, those everyday sensory and affective conditions that we're so used to aren't there any longer. And that causes us to reflect on our own place and how different the place that we've visited, maybe as a tourist, can cause us to kind of think about how we actually experience the world of our place, or we experience place, you know, in these kind of rather fundamental ways. So this kind of feeling and this kind of sensation is, I think, really, really important. And it moves away from this idea that everything we do is kind of full of meaning and is full of instrumental behavior. So there's a kind of much more radical thing going on here as well. But I just want to end, right, by saying something about Donald Trump. I know this is a bit of a leap, but people talk about Trump, right, all the time as you know, Trump's just this extraordinary figure, right? A very malevolent figure. But if you think about his appeal, is his appeal really about what he says, or is it about how he says it? In other words, a lot of what he says is so absurd and ridiculous. How can people kind of follow this? Why are people so seduced by his kind of message? And maybe what it is, it's to do with the kind of feelings that he stirs up. Maybe it's more to do with emotion than meaning. I'll just put that to you. You know, when we think about the kind of rise of populist politics, is that it's kind of really important, I think, for us to think about about how politics in the everyday is full of meaning. And there's a really good book, a really fantastic book by a friend of mine, Angarad Cross Stevens, who thinks about how in the UK, you know, how these sort of feelings become kind of really, really important in deciding politics and, you know, the state of the country and how people feel. So I don't think we can underestimate thinking about, you know, the atmospheric as part of this kind of wider turn to thinking about feelings, affect, sensation. To me, this just seems really obvious, is that the social sciences is concentrated far too much on meaning. And I'm not saying in any sense that we should forget about meaning at all, but I think we also should not neglect, you know, feeling. So meaning and feeling go together. And I want to put feeling back in to the equation. Does that answer? Sorry, that was a bit rambling, but I just just set me off on a train of thought.
Yes, I can really understand you, but can I ask another questions? By your narrative, I wonder that what's your definition of atmosphere, the difference with the sense of place? I'm really curious about that. Thank you.
So the atmosphere of a sense of place, I think it combines what we might call all those elements that I've mentioned. So the atmosphere is constructed, and of course it changes all the time, but we can sort of identify particular kinds of atmospheres of place in particular times. So the atmosphere of a suburban street, of a street in the suburbs, let's say in the south of England, there'll be lots of trees, the streets will be wide, there'll be big gardens, the houses are big. And so what happens in that space, in terms of the way in which the colour filters through the leaves of the branches, the light of the sun comes through the leaves of the branches, produce particular kinds of shadow, about the noises that come out of the houses, often subdued, maybe the smells of the cooking that come out, the distinctive smells of sort of local cooking and so forth. the busyness of the traffic, the amount of walking activity that takes place, the colour of the houses and the doors and windows of the houses and so forth. All these different elements feed into this atmosphere that changes in accordance with weather, according to the season of the year, according to events, what's happened. So one of the things we might want to think about, and I'm sure everybody can do this, is to think about how the atmospheres of their places changed during the pandemic. Think about the usual atmosphere of place and think about how when you went out for a walk during the pandemic, think about how different that was. And that might help think about what was missing from the usual ingredients that constitute and contribute to the atmospheres of place.
Thank you for your very insightful answer. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Yijin. So we have a congestion of quite a Q&A. So next is Jin Chen. I think she is a very important PhD student I want to introduce to you because she's currently focusing on a lot of your theory as her PhD thesis. Maybe you two should know each other. I will leave the floor to Jin.
Hi, Jin-Kwan.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, Professor Edensor. It's my honor to have the opportunity to communicate with you. My name is Jin Chen, a doctoral student at Hokkaido University. And my research topic is about terrorist performance in media space. And I read a lot of your research. It's very inspiring to me. And today's representation is very interesting topic about terrorism atmospheres. And I have some questions that look forward to your answer. And first, you mentioned that tourism atmospheres are not only related to the tourism destination, but also connected to the behaviors and the emotions, feelings of tourists. So I think that tourists are the co-producers of the tourism atmospheres. But I think in this time, tourism is no longer separate from people's daily lives, and it has become an extension of everyday life experience. So
I agree with you.
Yes, so tourist behaviors and emotions during travel might not always be directly related to the destination itself. For example, when I go to some tourism destinations with my friend, we always talk about something about our daily life, not connected to the tourism destination. But the emotion of this type of talk also influence the atmospheres in current are not related to destinations. So
okay, but let me ask you though, let me ask just before you ask the question, do you think that tourism offers an opportunity to have these kinds of conversations?
Yes.
So what you're saying is that, we are talking about everyday things, that relate to the rest of our lives. But when you're a tourist, does it allow you the space and time and reflexive disposition to kind of talk about these things?
Yes. So I want to know that how do you think about the interrelation between the atmospheres shaped by tourists and the atmosphere shaped by tourist destination? What's the relationship of the two?
Well, it's there's no single answer to this. It just depends, doesn't it? So you can imagine certain kinds of destinations that you go to. It doesn't even have to be a tourist thing. But let's say for instance that you go to. Let's give an example about going to two music concerts. The first music concert that you go to is by a band that you don't like very much, or you're not very interested in them, and you go along, and the rest of the crowd are going crazy, but you're not really that enthusiastic about it, and you're interested, but you stand at the back and you kind of watch the watch the band play, and you're not really engaged. You look at it more from I suppose, a kind of, an analytical perspective, let's say. But then you go next week, you go to a conference, maybe you go to see Blackpink. I don't know. But anyway, you go and see a sort of band that's you're really excited by, and you get very, very excited. And when they come on stage, you're already excited, and you cheer and you dance and you kind of join in with the rest of the throng. So both of those things produce a particular atmosphere. The same event, the same kind of event takes place, but your involvement in it varies. So, we can't make any kind of hard and fast generalizations about how we respond to these kind of atmospheres. But what I do think is that many tourist settings, they create the conditions or conditions that allow for the emergence of atmospheres. They create those conditions. They depend upon people to kind of feel these things, to acknowledge or to perform. And I think performance is kind of important here. So to perform in particular ways that contribute to the production of atmosphere. But as I've said, we can't be sure about this. We can never know. So atmospheres change, and the people who enter atmospheres, whether as tourists or not, have different responses to those atmospheres. And that also might depend on things that have happened in their personal lives. So if you've had a bereavement, and you go to a kind of exciting tourist destination, it might not have very powerful effects on you because you already come with this kind of feeling, with these feelings of loss and grief. So it's kind of difficult to make any general hard and fast rules, I think, about the relationship. Rather, we have to think of it as dynamic, contested, and fluid. I would say that.
Thank you for your answer. And I have another question about my research. As my research focuses on the role of media in shaping tourism activities, I've noticed that virtual space plays a significant role in shaping tourist atmospheres today. So do you believe that virtual tourism can provide atmospheres and experience comparable to those of physical travel? Or in other words, how do you think virtual spaces create tourist atmospheres?
So you're asking me about virtual spaces, yeah? And how they produce atmospheres. Is that what you're asking me?
I think so.
Yeah. Okay, so I think there's a really interesting paper, a quite brilliant paper, which you might know, by Gillian Rose and Monica Dagan. Do you know this paper? And it talks about how the designers of Doha in Qatar, before they created this city, produced all these photographic elements. And in these photographic elements, all these kind of photographic, the virtual photographs, they never existed. The place hadn't been created yet, but they look as if this is a kind of place that already exists, but it wasn't. And they produced these kind of, these photographs full of people, maybe with children playing or with kind of people watching music. And what's really interesting about this kind of virtual representation is it does conjure up certain kinds of atmospheres. So what I would say, and I think I would start with that paper because I think it's a fantastic paper. If you want, if you email me and I'll send you the references. But the other thing is that I think I would say, it's a very difficult thing, this kind of this virtual environment. There are, of course, virtual environments that are immersive. Like there's one in Tokyo, isn't it? You go in and the whole, it's a three-dimensional, I can't remember what it's called. It's a three-dimensional virtual environment into which you walk through, and all these, images and colours and image representations flow around you. So in that sense, this might be more powerful. But I do think that we have to be careful that we don't equate the visual to that we don't equate the sort of material and the actual to the virtual. I think the virtual can kind of give us a sense of what an atmosphere might be like, but we have to be fully materially and immersed in an embodied sense to kind of feel an atmosphere fully. And I think we can imagine it. There's no doubt we can do that, because there's a kind of an interesting way in which the visual always conjures up our previous experience. So I'll just give you an example. So I'm on a train and I'm going through some countryside, and I look out and I kind of see, you know, a little wood, right? A small area of woodland. But I've been in these kinds of areas of woodland physically, and I can look out and I can see this woodland, and through looking at it, I can conjure up and I can imagine what it feels like. I can imagine what it feels like. But it's not the same as being in the wood. It's not the same as actually being in the wood in an embodied sense. So I think there is a link between visual stimulation and the kind of visual stimulation that occurs in virtual worlds. But I don't think it's not as immersive, it's not as powerful, it's not as intense as being in the kind of actual world. Other people might disagree with me about this. You know, I think there are people who make claims for virtual space. I would regard those as hyperbole, as hyperbolic, as over-exaggerated. But in my view, they're not the same things, but they're like a pale echo. Does that make sense? A weak echo of what actual atmospheric, sensory, affective, emotional experience is like in a real place. I don't know whether you think that, whether you agree with that.
Thank you for your comments, and I'm looking forward to talking about the visual and physical space and the interaction between the virtual and the physical space with you more.
It's a really interesting question. And quite an important question, I think. So,
they are not same, but always have some influence to each other. Thank you for your comments.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. We have last question, a little bit similar, but more really particularly talk about the virtual reality place. Not just a virtual place in general, but this is more technology based. So we have another question coming up. Maybe Tim, do you want to engage with this one first about virtual reality? Is it possible to create atmospheres through technologies like virtual reality? If possible, then what are the differences between those atmospheres?
Well, as I've just said, I think that we can get very involved in sort of virtual worlds, but I think they're different, except that now what we're having is now what we do increasingly have are these worlds that are also actual worlds, in a sense, is that the virtual is transmitted into the actual. So like many of you will know these exhibitions that are currently taking place where a Van Gogh painting or another artist, a painting by another artist, is transmitted in an actual space and in an enlarged way. It's kind of magnified and it plays across the space. Similarly, like this, I wish I could remember the name of this place in Tokyo, where you enter a world that is, you know, it's like a virtual world, but you're in it, you're immersed in it in a kind of physical sense. So, you know, I think you imagine that this is going to, you know, there's going to be many more of such spaces, and these, which we might even think of as tourist spaces, will kind of take off and become popular. And I suppose in a way, you know, these sorts of things have kind of existed for quite a long time in fairgrounds and amusement parks, but now with the technology, we can do them in kind of much more convincing and extraordinary ways. So yes, I think there's the kind of there's the one-dimensional, the two-dimensional virtual worlds which interact with and inform our experience of the world out there, of the actual world, and then there are these kind of three-dimensional spaces that we enter that are kind of can be extremely powerful. And they
Okay.
can conjure up very powerful atmospheres.
Right. So let's move to the next one, because I also want to ask one more question. Do you want to ask live?
Thank you very much, Professor Edensor. Thank you for your excellent presentation on the atmosphere. I'm a PhD candidate from Rikyo University in Japan. My name is Naisin Kang. You can call me Carnation. And the keywords of my research are food, social media, and user-generated photos. I would like to ask you a question. In the current society with advancement of social media, we all take photos of our meals during traveling and then post to the social media, such as first a camera and then fork. And the photos will show the impression of their dining experience. I would like to ask that, based on your experience, is it possible to investigate the traveler's preference for the dining atmosphere by using photos they share? Thank you very much.
That's an interesting question and quite a difficult one, because I think that, right, to go back to what I was saying before about images, I think if we look at an image, it can conjure up, it can evoke particular kinds of sensations. So, for instance, the obvious thing to say is that when we look at photographs of food, which I know is kind of incredibly popular now, it can invoke ideas of taste. So we can't just look at the food without thinking about what it tastes like. Like the visual is a really important part of dining, of eating, right? So it is. And if you take the visual away,
yeah,
some people say that we don't taste in the same way, or things don't taste the same. Science suggests this is the case, is that actually the visual is really important in defining how we taste things. So with that in mind, we might consider how these photographs of food do that. I suppose one of the problems with this is that what people tend to do when they take photographs of food. I mean, I've been with people, when they've done this is quite a common thing to do now, right? It's in fact a very popular thing to do, is that you only see the food. So they don't tend to focus on the food in context, in terms of the spatial context in where that food's been eaten, i.e. the restaurant and so forth. And so I think that becomes difficult then to think about how atmospheres might be conjured up. So you might imagine the atmosphere that surrounds the plate of food, but that's quite difficult to do. That's quite hard to do when you haven't got the other kinds of visual information. So I think it depends on the image, but as far as I'm aware, most of those images solely focus on the plate of food itself, rather than people eating it or the ambient surroundings. So I would think that it's quite difficult to conjure up an atmosphere. Although, of course, we can imagine it, based on our previous experience of eating similar food or different food.
Okay, thank you very much. I have learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're almost time, and the last question belongs to me. So,
okay, before you say it, Mo, can I just say, if anybody wants to get in touch with me and ask me any questions via email, please do so. I'm very happy to answer anything. And if you require further references, or I can send you papers as well if you want, PDFs.
Yeah, right. Is that okay to share your email here? I will share your email.
Of course it is. Yeah, just share the email.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just shared the Team Senses email in the chat.
There it is. That should all be lowercase, but yes.
Yes. All right. My question, I have one comment. A lot of atmosphere places, such as Ireland, for example, it's normally associated with weather. I think weather factor is also highly influential for the atmosphere. But that's not my center focus. I'm really interested with the relationship between atmosphere with authenticity. Because, for example, from a creative tourism study perspective, nowadays those creative tourists, they always want to experience things, feeling things, and they want to live like a local. They want to go to the restaurant where the local people goes. But if all the tourists try to go to where the local people try to go, then local will go somewhere else. So it's like always a kind of chasing some
interesting. Yeah.
So I would like to ask more about this kind of consideration related to authenticity.
Okay, 1 second. Hello? Hello? Oh, sorry. Sorry, someone was ringing my doorbell. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. The authenticity. I mean, I don't want to think about. I think authenticity has been played about with too much, and so I think really I don't like. I think we should move away from authenticity. Really, it's just it dominates tourist thinking far too much. Well, the question has a really interesting notion in terms of the kind of atmospheres that we expect local people to produce in situations that maybe aren't really about mass tourism, but they're about, you know, if you like, more kind of interactive, more sustainable forms of tourism. I think it's a really interesting question. And so this puts quite a lot of pressure really on people to behave in a particular way, we might say. But of course, it's up to the locals how they do that, you know, and how removed they are from tourists and how engaged they are with tourists. I think that's a kind of that would be a really interesting question to explore amongst tourists, because of course tourists want to go to these places to experience particular kinds of atmospheres that are generated by the locals themselves. Right. So they want to go into local shops where friendly locals say, hello, good morning, how are you? What do you want to eat? Or local restaurants where the local folk are eating, or, you know, just ordinary streets where kind of local people hang out. And I kind of think this is really interesting. This is a really interesting question about how do we, first of all, think about what it is that tourists want, what kinds of atmospheres, what kinds of local atmospheres they want, and what they might draw away from, when things become too local or maybe exclusively local, maybe they're not very comfortable. But we also need to ask the question about the locals, about what it is that they produce and how they kind of want to generate particular kinds of tourist experience, what their responsibilities are for that. So, I mean, there's so much in that question. There's a lot of issues there that I think really need to be unpacked and thought about. It's a brilliant question.
Yeah, maybe I will consider to focus on that in future.
Yeah, I think it's a great topic.
Okay, thank you very much. We have one last question. This must be the last question. So
yes, it must be. Yes, because I've got to go and answer the door.
Yes. So, Gaoxin, do you want to ask in live?
Oh, thank you so much. Dear Professor Edison, thank you so much for presentations for us. And my name is Gaoxin. I'm also a doctoral student from Hokkaido University. And I also have the questions here. That is, there are different types of the atmospheres you described just now. And I just want to say that as for one type of the atmosphere, different people has different feeling or the emotions to it. How to define it and how to distinguish it. And do you have some ways to solve the problem? Thank you.
You mean how can we identify those people who are excited by an atmosphere and drawn into it, and those who are kind of repulsed by it, who feel very uncomfortable in it? I mean, I guess first of all, the thing to do is to kind of to watch, is to see who moves away, and to see who gathers and contributes to the kind of intense atmosphere. So we can actually do it through participant observation. The second way we would do it is, of course, to interview people. And I think in a way, you know, that might be kind of quite difficult for those people who are drawn towards the atmosphere, who are inside it. But those people who feel uncomfortable with the atmosphere and move away from it, I think they might be much more reflective. And so if we interview them, I think they might kind of give some fairly interesting responses about what it is that they don't like about a particular kind of atmosphere. So really participant observation and interviewing are the only ways in which we can do this, really. You know, by watching, by observing what happens, and then interviewing those who kind of seem to be kind of frightened or disoriented or feel out of place through the atmosphere. So I think these things change again. But yeah, I think in terms of exploring the atmospheres themselves, I think, again, we can't really combine autoethnography with this, because unless it is that we ourselves, you know, we can think about why we ourselves are drawn to a particular atmosphere or kind of want to move away from a particular kind of atmosphere. So that will change quite a lot, I think. So, I mean, that's how I would answer the question.
Oh, okay, thank you so much.
Okay, Mo?
I think it's the lunchtime for you, right? Thank you very much, everybody.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, 12 o'clock,
Oh, yeah.
10 past
Wow.
12.
Thank you very much for your time. I think it's a very fruity festival here for our faculty member and student. And I think definitely one time is not enough. We should invite you again, either
Lots of
online
things I
or
can talk about.
face-to-face, or even on-site here. Sometime maybe next year. So
Yes, yeah, sounds great.
Yeah, so
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you, and thanks everyone for the great questions.
Yeah.
Really good questions that I think have helped me kind of expand on some of the ideas that I have. So thank you for that.
Yeah, we are also looking forward to read this research on paper. So if you
what I'll do, Mo, is it'll be out, right? So the book won't be out till next year. So what I'll do, because I just got the proofs, I will send you a copy. Okay. Now you can't.
Yeah.
You can't quote it, but you can cite it, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
so you can say the so forthcoming. You can't actually quote the actual words from it, but you can summarize what I say. So
I can share with some students here with the inner.
I'll send it. I'll send you that shortly.
Thank you very much. I also shared your email. If everybody have a private question about this topic and similar research, I think Team Center did tons of research. A lot of things you can definitely keep develop for your own studies. And all right, I will wrapping up today's session. Thank you very much. Wish you have a great day. And everybody, our audience, students, faculty members, thank you very much for attending today. We have more than 20 people in the audience side. And wish you have a great evening and see you next time.
Thanks, folks. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.